Did you know that every single ACL injury was all in the offensive possession? That means that everyone was actually driving into the paint or into the key. So number one, we're going to go through who actually got ACL injuries. So we're going to see that Kawhi Leonard from the LA Clippers, there's Spencer Dinwiddie, there's Thomas Bryant from the Washington Wizards, who then also had an ACL injury. There's Markelle Fultz, there's Jamal Murray, and there's Dario Saric. Now, bear in mind, all these 7 players had ACL injuries of differing extents within this past season. Let's go straight into the stats. Number 1, did you know that every single ACL injury was all in the offensive possession? That means that everyone was actually driving into the paint or into the key of some sort. So in terms of location of injury, there was 3 out of 7 people that actually had injuries in the paint. And 6 out of 7 of those were all in the key. So the outlier over here was actually Kawhi Leonard. In terms of the mechanism of injury, this is where it gets split up in 3 categories. So there is contact, direct, and indirect, and non-contact. Okay, so now within the NBA, interestingly enough, there was no ACL injury that was a complete direct contact that then caused an ACL injury. The first one is in terms of non-contact, and we have 3 different players that actually have non-contact ACL injuries. So the first one is Dario Saric as well as Jonathan Isaac. Now, both actually do this 2-foot land, and then they both have this slight twist or knee valgus position or mechanism, which then you can clearly see. Okay, so now in terms of Jamal Murray's mechanism of injury, he actually does a single leg jump, pushes off of that leg, and then you can also see that knee valgus, and straight away he grabs onto that knee. So with the contact group, we actually have 4 different players that are in this category. Now we're going to group 2 of them up now. Where you can see Kawhi Leonard as well as Spencer Dinwiddie. They both actually have contact injuries where essentially there's that kind of lateral outside contact, which then causes this kind of forced change in direction or rotational force, which then causes that ACL injury. And you can see both of them are quite similar in terms of mechanisms. Okay, so this is a pretty big one. We're going to see Fultz actually have a couple of different mechanisms, right? He actually goes into this kind of lateral contact or outside contact with the opposing player, and then we see a single leg jump as well as that kind of rotation. So just imagine the amount of force that is force upon that knee of his. Now, the outlier to the NBA as well as in terms of the literature is actually a hyperextension injury. When we take a look at the mechanism behind Thomas Bryant, you can pretty much see his ankle sort of goes into this lateral ankle sprain position, but then his knee gets into a forced hyperextension position. Both Spencer Dinwiddie as well as Kawhi Leonard, they both actually have been reported to have partial ACL tears. So there's 4 guys that actually have ACL tears. That includes Jamal, Saric, and then Fultz. Now here's the interesting part. Every single NBA player opted to actually have ACL surgery. Now, I'm not sure whether or not that's just because of how America is, or maybe just because they're elite athletes, or whether it's actually because they have the off season to come around, or maybe they're just not too confident in terms of literature for copers. So that's those that actually have ACL injuries and they basically continue on without actually going through surgery. We're going to take a look at the time of actually when they actually had their ACL injury. And this is pretty interesting because I think fatigue can play a role in ACL injury. So interestingly enough, there was actually 3 players that actually had ACL injuries in the first quarter. There was also 2 players that had ACL injuries in the fourth quarter, right? Now, then you might start to think, okay, if it was the first quarter, did they have proper warm-ups between that time? And if we go into the fourth quarter, it's like, is fatigue actually a big factor to all this? Interestingly enough, there's also one particular player that has it in the third.
Spencer Dinwiddie of the Brooklyn Nets.
And no one actually has it in the second quarter, which is pretty interesting. Now, when we take a look at the season, we actually realize that there is 5 players that actually have it in season. This is before it goes to playoffs. and 2 of them actually have it in postseason. So now, out of those players, it's very, very interesting to note that actually only 1 out of those 7 have actually already been deemed fit to be able to play in terms of sport. That's Spencer Dinwiddie. Now, I've been tracking and monitoring how he actually goes through his rehab, and it is amazing. I cannot believe that within 6 to 7 months, Spencer Dinwiddie is pretty much deemed fit and ready to go back to full competitive basketball playing. It is insane, and I think it's props to those that are doing his rehab and training. And when you actually take a look at Spencer Dinwiddie and how he moves, only 6 months down the track, he is killing it. His movements are so smooth, and you can't really tell which knee he actually had the ACL injury on. Firstly, thank you for watching it. If you made it this far, I really appreciate your views and your opinions. So feel free to leave a comment down below and let me know what you think of this particular video and what you want to see more of. Feel free to like it, subscribe if you like, and if you've learned something, I've done my job well. Feel free to check out my other video as well. You'll be able to see this video of Devin Kennedy. He has an insane injury, and I kid you not, it is not for the faint-hearted. So just don't look at it if you're not ready for it. All right, take care, guys. Love you all, and see you soon.